Hi, everyone. I am Reverend David Miller. I'm the Senior Minister of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Fairfax in Oakton, Virginia. And this is the second of our maybe two, maybe more video casts that we're doing with my good friend and fabulous ministerial colleague, the Reverend Abhi Janamanchi. Reverend Abhi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, David. Hello, friends. I'm Abhi Janamanchi. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm serving Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Bethesda, Maryland. And as always, it's a joy to join my friend David Miller on this now second video cast that we're doing. And joining us today, we have our dear friend and colleague and co-conspirator, the Reverend Nancy McDonald Ladd.
It's so great to conspire with you two again. Indeed, I'm Nancy McDonald Ladd. I currently serve as Director of Communications and Public Ministry at our UUA and a long time maker of trouble with these two esteemed colleagues.
Good trouble.
Usually, I mean,
That's right. Well, we're so glad you could join us today. Thank you so much. We know that you have a busy Zoom schedule, so it's great for you to be here. Last week, we talked about many things leading up to the election. The title of our podcast last week was Faith, Hope, Anxiety, and Fear. And Avi and I agreed that we could talk a lot about anxiety and fear, but we tried to talk about faith and hope. I wonder how you're feeling about faith, hope, anxiety, and fear in these days preceding the election.
I mean, I have my whole own internal process going on in addition to working for the association and having my own political realities and commitments. My spouse is also a political scientist and a poll designer. So we have multiple stakes at play in this house in what's happening all around us. When I am not enraged or merely quaking, I think the real place that I land in these days is with a renewed clarity about the importance of our institutions, especially the institutions within a democracy that have always been an essential component of the healthy functioning of that democracy. And that includes, frankly, congregations, community organizations, exactly the kind of clusters of people who find and punctuate life for one another that we're trying to create within Unitarian Universalist spaces. And also, I mean, it's not for nothing. Denominations, American progressive religious denominations have been at our best um, a productive ground for organizing and culture change and the centering of justice and the centering of rooted values for at least the entirety of the 20th century and beyond. You just try to have the civil rights movement without the African American church in America, even try to build any kind of large scale movement for justice without progressive denominations, including ours, showing up in organized and strategic ways. It would be very difficult to do. So mine is an institutional ministry right now because I think we've never needed the institutions more in a democratic society.
I love the fact that you brought up the civil rights movement as it related to religious communities and faith communities. I think that sometimes we underestimate, as Unitarian Universalists, the ability that faith communities have in positive change in the world. In fact, we have just adopted some new values in Unitarian Universalism that undergird, we'll say, the kinds of movements that progressive movements of faith have taken over the, I don't know, last half century or more. Um, I'd be happy to hear, of course, what Abhi thinks about this too. But what is it that you think our values add or bring forth for us that speak to the kind of things that you're talking about? How faith movements can be on the leading edge of change.
Um, I will try to be brief. I've been living inside of these questions so much lately that it's hard.
That's okay. We have a little time. Go ahead.
Uh, Firstly, I can say that within our own Unitarian Universalist discourse, sometimes we speak about the shared values as if it is this newfangled thing, as if it is this wholly, completely reimagined set of understandings that has sprung whole cloth from the UUA General Assembly. Well, that is just patently not the case. Unitarian Universalists have been centering love since before we ever called ourselves Unitarian Universalists, or frankly, since before we ever called ourselves Unitarians or Universalists separately. This idea that the very essence of love is the operational principle of faith community instead of justice or even fairness or even sacrifice, although I think sometimes we could use a little bit more sacrifice in our communities. Anyway, this idea that love has been at the center instead of any number of other concepts that serve as centering forces for religious community and for people. We have always been preaching this gospel. We have been preaching this gospel since before any of us were alive. And so this commitment not only to a truly ancient understanding of the centrality of love, and indeed the identification of God with love, is not newfangled or controversial. It's a reassertion of a longstanding commitment. And it's also a reassertion of a longstanding commitment to the fact that church changes. It has always changed every single time. You go back to the Transcendentalists, and I tell you, every generation that rose up as new preachers and new leaders had some whole rebellious thing that left the generation before them all a twitter, right? Every generation of our faith is evolving because we have ever been and will always be a living tradition. So what I'm saying is, I think it's amazing that we are a historical tradition still preaching the same thing we've been preaching since before we even had the identity we know of now. And I think it is a sacred thing that we are duty bound to reframe and redefine and reconceive that age-old gospel for a different era. And now we have, instead of something more elaborate, we do have these words, these phrases, this centering of love that we can use in any number of ways, theologically and otherwise, in our congregations.
Well, Nancy, I think you just framed it so beautifully and got to the heart of the issue about how we have always centered love in our tradition that even precedes our being Unitarians and Universalists. In fact, I would go as far as to say that we have centered the idea and the practice of love is God in our tradition. You know, God is love, yes, but for us, love is God, and in that way, as an active principle that is embodied in all that we are and all that we do and how we show up in the world and with each other. And to me, that is a piece that really enlivens us. And what I see are current values as a more explicit way of articulating that age-old principle that we have tried to live by and our forebears sacrificed. And you're right, we could use more sacrifice in our faith now. But, I really feel that this election is about our really showing up to embody our values. And in that way, it is a very stark call to embody the values of justice, equity, pluralism, transformation, and love in all that we are and all that we do. And in that way, it's voting is just one aspect of it. It's to me a call to action to live into the promise of what these values and our faith represents. And right now, democracy is at a crossroads, and we are being called to choose a path and move forward together.
And we're being called to center love, not just like on our path up to the ballot box, but to center love in the incredibly anxious days of waiting, perhaps weeks of waiting. Like, let's just clear it up right here. We are almost certainly not going to know the outcome of this election on November 5th. By the time we wake up on November 6th, we probably will not know. And so we need to spiritually prepare ourselves to center love for ourselves with our community in the time of waiting, in that ever painful liminal space. And we need to center love in how we show up in any number of organizing spaces leading up to the certification of the election, the inauguration, all of the various movements that will sweep this society, no matter what the outcome of this presidential race are.
And one of the things that a colleague of ours says is sometimes love means having to say no. In other words, this is not a passive love we're talking about. I mean, that you two are talking about either. This is an active love. This is a position that we need to take action and be on the forefront of what's happening in our world as we try to create beloved community. But the reason that we're doing that is not just to be passive and say, oh, everybody should love each other. That's not the kind of love we're talking about. We're talking about an active love that helps to bring our values to the forefront, that helps our people live those values as best we can, knowing that, as they say, never a failure, always a lesson. We will learn from what we do and don't. I mean, there'll be plenty of times we'll make mistakes and do things where we'll have to apologize and move forward and so on and so forth. But to not do anything active, I don't think is necessarily practicing who we are as Unitarian Universalists, as we believe in we don't often talk about what we believe in, but one of the things that we often say we believe in is creating heaven here on earth. And to do that, you can't sit back and not do anything. And people always talk about that in some ways, about, I did this in the 70s, I did this in the 80s, I did this in the 90s. We're saying that everybody has to go out and be on the front lines of some sort of protest, but we're saying there's an attitude of activity that comes with this kind of love. And that's how we adopt, I think, our values into practice.
So,
Dude, sometimes love means doing a low ego thing. Sometimes love means letting someone else lead while we follow. Sometimes love means not assuming that our opinion is the most operative opinion in a given moment.
Sometimes love means, really being present to our fears and our prejudices, and learning to live with that discomfort and engage not just with the beauty of the world, but also the pain and the suffering of the world. But learning that we learn to cultivate that courage and that capacity, not just by ourselves, but do that in community. And do that with one another, and support and challenge and inspire each other to be engaged.
One of the things I say about that, Abhi, is that it's hard for us to grow as solo practitioners. We grow in relation to others. And one of the things that it challenges us in community is when we're practicing Unitarian Universalism is both the joys and the challenges that we receive from being in community with people. Oh, we're complicated. We can be difficult. We know that we don't always agree. And with that said, part of what we're trying to practice is how to do that in a way where we can live together and obviously not kill each other all the time, which is something that, we're going to have. And I don't want to, sound Pollyanna, but also save the planet. I mean, there are ways for us to practice this that we can't be totally responsible for the wars in the world and the way the planet is suffering, but we certainly can figure out ways to do this in our communities that help model that as best we can.
And I think in our communities, we can model the compassion that holds each other's personal pain, both as a good in and of itself, like goal accomplished with that, but also as a practice for the kind of compassion that is needed in the body politic to hold and attend to the pain and the desolation of our neighbors, of those who are bodily at risk, of those whose families are bodily at risk. So if in congregational life we practice the spiritual labor of compassion and attentiveness on the micro level, it enables us then to, like, this sounds terrible, but like infect the body politic with people who are well versed in this practice of moving in fundamentally compassionate ways, which makes it a lot harder for the greater body politic to ignore the great desolating crises of our time.
That's so beautiful, Nancy, of seeing our communities as places, laboratories where we learn that fragile art of hospitality, as Bill Schultz put it, and learning to put love into practice, making love work, so that we can, at least by learning a bit about it, we may be able to take it out into the world and practice it.
And the other thing I think about in DC, this is so true for both of your congregations, is that we are a place where the actual world changers, like the people who have the ability to, in fact, pull the levers of power, we are the place where those people can come and have their spiritual lives tended, have their hurts mended, have a sense of community. I'm painfully aware, standing in a pulpit in Washington, D.C. every single Sunday, that there were people that I'm preaching to who make decisions that impact us all. And also who operate, nonprofits and organizations that have the power to heal enormously more people than my sermon itself ever could. So we're amplified in not only the positionality of power of our folks, but in the fact that what we do has wings in the people who are well capable of changing more than we personally could ever be.
It's a great observation. Thanks, Nancy. Nancy, I'm sitting here and I'm listening to you talk, and I can only think about your book, After the Good News, and the need and power of lament, which is something that you've talked about in your book and otherwise. And I'm just wondering, how do these times call for that in these moments, in the way that you're thinking about the world?
Did you say the need and power for
Lament.
lament?
Lament.
Well, see, here's the thing, is that if our communities don't have some sort of authentic vocabulary and ritual practice of lament, then our communities are in no way meeting the moment in which we live. And if we show up and perform for one another the abstract notion of a moment completely divorced from our reality, it is not, in fact, spiritually sustaining soul food. So what happens is that then we are not nurtured to go infect the world with nurturance. The world changers are not nurtured to go pull the levers of power in the direction of justice, if what they're showing up for is a performance of fakery. As I wrote in that book, and I will say a swear word and you will cut it out if you need to.
Oh, we'll probably keep it in.
I believe that Unitarian Universalists in our congregations can smell the lingering miasma of bullshit from a mile away, which means that when we are gathered in worship, when we're in small group ministries, when we're doing the learning and growing that we're doing, it behooves us to be authentic and to speak and sing truly into the suffering reality of our days, which includes lamentation and includes the call to action on the other side of lamentation, includes the constant coexistence of the two.
Does that include smelling the bullshit within our own communities?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think, well, I'm going to get myself in trouble, but congregations don't particularly like it when sometimes leaders, and this is not just ministers, religious educators, board leaders, when leaders call out the performative bullshit among us, in which all of us are complicit, it's uncomfortable. And congregations don't always like it. They want us to perform sometimes that we all are okay. And I know deep in my soul that the shared yearning is for authenticity. So if we can push through the discomfort of naming what is, even when what is kind of unpleasant, we can approach the authenticity of visioning what can be. But you can't approach a real vision of what can be unless you can be with what is.
Say that again. I want you to say that again. That's an important line.
All right. You cannot even begin to approach the vision of what will be unless you can be with the discomfort of what actually is.
Yeah. That's
And
right.
that's hard. That's really hard. We would rather just bullshit each other, kinda.
No, that's good. I mean, we talked about this in the first video cast. What are we calling this? Podcast, video cast? I don't know. But the first thing we talked about was, faith, hope, fear, and anxiety. And Abhi and I have plenty of fear and anxiety about what's happening in the world. And if we don't step into the pulpit and be honest about that, then we are doing this performative stuff. I won't say bullshit. Then we are doing this performative stuff that is not good for our souls and not good for the souls who are sitting in our congregations. It's important for us, I think, not to be taken away by what's happening in the world. The social media, we talked about that a little last week too. But to acknowledge it, to lament it, is the place where we need to be in order to, as you say, I think, move on and have a vision of a realistic future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. That's some good stuff.
Sometimes at the UUA, we're talking about okay, what is the moment we're in? What is it we're called to do in this moment? What's possible as we move out of this moment? Yeah. You can't do that till you say, what is the moment we're in?
That's right.
Can I share something from our colleague, the Reverend Victoria Safford?
Always.
Yeah, she's talking about this active engagement with love. And she says, our mission is to plant ourselves at the gates of hope, not the prudent gates of optimism, which are somewhat narrower, not the stalwart, boring gates of common sense, not the strident gates of self-righteousness, which creak on shrill and angry hinges, but a different, sometimes lonely place, the place of truth-telling, about your own soul, first of all, and its condition, the place of resistance and defiance, the piece of ground from which you see the world both as it is and as it could be, as it will be, the place from which you glimpse not only struggle, but joy in the struggle.
And as always, Victoria says it so
I know,
much.
Right?
Everything we just talked about in beautiful prose. I mean,
yeah.
Always. Yeah.
Amen. Amen. I'll give you a sneak peek behind the UUA comms curtain to tell you that We've actually commissioned from Victoria Safford and JJ Flagg, our UUA chaplains, 3 pieces to share in the day or so after the election. There's a waiting piece. There's a Trump wins piece. There's a we know Harris has won piece. They're all done. I anticipate we'll share 2 of them.
Yeah. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for your time today. It is always a joy. Of course, we've worked together now for a number of years, and this is kind of a different situation for us. Abhi and I are interviewing, this important director of communications for the UUA. It's an
And
honor.
public witness.
And public ministry, yes. It's an honor to spend this time with you, and of course, my friend Abhi. So thank you so much. And our third version of this will come. We're not sure, but hopefully there'll be more. It's a joy. Any last words?
I love you guys.
Reverend Abhi.
Reverend David.
I love you all too. Let's end it with that.
Love at the center.
Love at the center. Thank you all so much. Take care.
You.